Hello, and good afternoon if you're watching from here in the United States, and good day if you're tuning in now from Australia, and a very, very early morning good day if you're tuning in from Hong Kong or Taipei. I'm Charles Edel, Senior Advisor and Australia Chair here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the discussion today on the state of Australia-China relations and whether we have reached a new starting point. Now, at the beginning of this month, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made the first visit by an Australian leader to China since 2016. The first visit of an Australian PM to China in 7 years underscores the extent to which bilateral relations have deteriorated and reflects, perhaps, recent signs of easing tensions. Now, a little context up front. Over the past several years, Australia's relationship with China deteriorated, and it did so rather swiftly. But it wasn't that long ago that Australians had a much rosier vision of China. In 2014, Xi Jinping visited Australia and talked about an era of friendship, goodwill, and prosperity. The last part mattered a lot. From 2009 to 2019, Australian exports to China tripled to $110 billion a year, accounting for nearly 40% of Australian exports. As China grew and as it modernized, Australia grew wealthy. But what was once a mutually beneficial economic and commercial partnership took a turn as Beijing began to seek more influence and control in Australian society and domestic affairs. The Chinese government sought to influence the Chinese diaspora in Australia, attempted to silence debate about China on university campuses, subjected Australia to economic coercion, and explored setting up Chinese naval bases within striking distance of Australia. When the Australian government called for a WHO investigation into the origins of COVID-19 in 2020, Beijing responded by imposing an unprecedented wave of punitive trade measures on Australia. Unsurprisingly, Australian public opinion shifted in response to China's actions, with only 15% of Australians now saying that they trust China somewhat or a great deal. That's a 40% decrease in just over 4 years. Now, the election of the Albanese government last May presented an opportunity for both sides to improve relations, and Prime Minister Albanese promised that while he would change the government's tone and rhetoric towards China, he would not change the direction of Australia's China policies. And indeed, Labor has kept most of the China policy from the last government in place while also working to restore diplomatic engagement with Beijing. The result was a slow-motion reset. Albanese first met Xi on the sidelines of the G20 in Bali in November of this past year and declared that we're always going to be better off when we have dialogue and are able to talk constructively and respectfully. Some trade barriers were removed by China. One of the Australian citizens detained in China was released. Several high-profile meetings between senior officials took place, all culminating with Prime Minister Albanese's trip to China at the beginning of the month. This seemingly was a successful trip. Albanese retraced the steps of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, his trip 50 years ago, and he was even called a handsome boy by the Chinese premier. But if high-level contact has resumed and the compliments have started flowing, it's still unclear what exactly comes next. What exactly does stabilization between Beijing and Canberra mean in practice? What are some of its limitations? What are the larger knock-on effects for Australia's foreign policy, its defense strategy, and trade relations? And just as important, what does it mean for Canberra's other relationships in Southeast Asia, across the Pacific, with the Japanese, and of course with the United States of America? To assess how this visit met Australia's goal of stabilizing relations with China, and what this means for the future trajectory of Australia's China policy, I'm thrilled to have an absolutely all-star cast of 3 insightful observers of Australia-China relations and Australian foreign policy: Will Glasgow, Lavina Lee, and Ewan Grant. Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent in Taipei and was previously the China correspondent. In 2018, he won the Keith MacDonald Award for Business Journalist of the Year. He previously worked at the AFR, and he's joining us from Hong Kong at 6 a.m., no less. Welcome, Will, and thank you. Lavina Lee is a senior lecturer at Macquarie University in Sydney and an adjunct fellow of the Australia Chair here at CSIS. She's published numerous articles, book chapters, research reports, and commentary on U.S. foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, on the Quad, on Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, and the role of democracy in the region. Lavina has also published on India's foreign policy and security. Finally, last but certainly not least, Ewan Graham, who is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Ewan publishes on the US's role in the Indo-Pacific, Australia-China relations, maritime security and strategy, and the Korean Peninsula. He's worked in think tanks in Australia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, and is the author of, most recently, the book Australia's Security in China's Shadow, which really is the broader contours of our conversation. I told Ewan I would hold up his book. It is a cracking read, and I recommend it to everyone. Now, I'll start off with a question or two for each of our panelists before getting into a broader discussion between all of us, and then opening up our conversation to all of you who are watching online. If you have questions, please submit them through the CSIS website, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Will, let me start with you, because you actually were with the Prime Minister on his trip to China. Can you tell us a little bit about the energy on both sides? How were both sides talking about it while they were on the trip? And what were your main takeaways from the trip itself?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. The energy on the trip is really interesting. It really depended on the audience, right? And this is, at least from the Australian side, it's one of the interesting things about the relationship right now. So when the Prime Minister would speak to his Chinese counterparts in the little bits of the open meetings that we could attend, so when I was there in the Great Hall of the People, hearing him respond after Premier Lee called him a handsome boy, I mean, that was wildly positive, right? I mean, I laughed in the Great Hall of the People. I didn't think I would be doing that, right? And he did too. And the Australian side just, this kind of disbelief at how much the Chinese leadership was laying it on during the trip, at least publicly, at least openly. I mean, it was really head snapping when you look at, as you said in that intro, where the Australia-China relationship's been. I mean, Australia had the worst relationship in the world with China. And here our Prime Minister, a few years on, is being sort of toasted in the Great Hall. So super positive there. In all the interactions with the journalist pack, though, Prime Minister's got to deal with the Australian domestic assessment on China. And they haven't forgotten. I mean, as you said in surveys, most Australians have a really wary idea about China. And so there was a real kind of tone shift as we'd have the press conferences with a lot of skepticism from the journalists, and the Prime Minister sort of struggling to stitch together the more positive message he was giving publicly to the Chinese leadership, while also being realistic about the reality of where this relationship's at right now and what its recent history's been.
Let me actually stay on that for a little bit too, because you used the word neck snapping, but that was actually the title of a piece that you had in the Inquirer over the weekend. China's neck snapping change in tone on Australia. That is, until last year, as you just pointed out, Australia's relationship with China was appalling. Australia was in the doghouse. Now the Chinese premier is busy calling your prime minister a handsome boy. Can you walk us through what accounts for this change in Beijing?
Yeah, well, as you said at the start, I mean, China's used the change in Australian government to try to improve this relationship. That's not a novel technique by China. That's something they did with South Korea after its 2016 breakdown over that. It's something they've done with other governments. It's something they've not been able to do with Canada because the Canadian people haven't changed their government, so that relationship remains appalling. But look, they've taken advantage of that change in government, and it's given a big opportunity to the Albanese government to do not very much at all, but improve the relationship. So there's been a change in the maybe more disciplined language from the government, although even that I think is exaggerated a bit by some people. For the most part, all the policy settings are where they were, but they're inherited policies, so there's not been new ones. And so China has changed its approach to Australia. I mean, Australia's not unique in that. We just saw overnight there's a change in approach from Beijing to America as well recently. It seems that it's linked to the state of the Chinese economy. It seems it's linked to some sort of internal grumbling about the final year of the COVID zero policy and a bunch of other domestic pressures. I mean, we don't get a very good detail of how decisions are made in Beijing. Something's changed. The exact reasons are up for debate a bit, but something's changed in Beijing primarily, and that's led to this opportunity for the improvement of the relationship, which has definitely happened with Australia.
Yeah, let me flip over to Lavina, if you don't mind, to continue the conversation, because you've given us speculation at least that something's changed in the water in Beijing. Maybe it's the end of zero COVID. Maybe it's the state of the Chinese economy. Maybe it's a number of other factors, but something has led Beijing to recalibrate over the past year and a half or so. Lavina, I'd like to kind of focus it in on Canberra for a second. Can you kind of broaden out, not for a discussion of what happened up in China, but what are the factors that led Labor to undertake this visit in the first place? What are the objectives that they were seeking? And do you think they were able to achieve some of what they were trying to do on this trip?
Well, I think both Will and you have detailed the kind of diplomatic deep freeze that Australia's been put in since I think about January 2020 to June 2022. There hasn't been any high-level ministerial contact between China and Australia. So that tells you something about the state of the relationship at the time. And this, April 2020 was around the time where China started its campaign of economic coercion against Australia, which ended up being around $20 billion worth of Australian goods and trade. And I think the current government, in the lead up to its election last year, was very critical of the previous Morrison government and its handling of the China relationship. And it talked about, as you said, undisciplined tone. I think they like to use the word tone, that effectively they're arguing that Australian government handling was unduly provocative, that we were unnecessarily provocative in the way that we dealt with China. So I think it was an instinctive kind of blaming of the previous government for the deterioration of relations, even though we know at that time China was going through that wolf warrior diplomacy period. So in a way, I'm not sure whether Australia would have escaped, even if we had used a different tone but carried on the same types of policies. Now, China, I think, has responded to the fact that you have a change of government and that you had an openness there to kind of improve the relationship. The current government has been very obvious about wanting to do that. So one of its objectives, I think there were three main objectives. One was the resumption of diplomatic dialogue at the highest levels, which they've obviously achieved. It started, I think, in June of last year when Richard Marles was able to meet his counterpart. And as you said, it's continued on since there. And the second was the resumption of unrestricted or unobstructed trade with China. So the removal of those coercive trade tariffs and other restrictions that China had imposed. And up until now, most of those restrictions have been removed. We've got about $3 billion left that are about wine, lobster, Australian meat. And I think Australia, hopes that all of those restrictions will be removed by the time in the next 3 to 6 months. Now, thirdly was the release of Australian citizens that have been detained in China. And we know that recently Cheng Lei was released, an Australian journalist who was held in detention for a number of years. We didn't know why. And it was only after she was released that her transgressions were revealed, and it was really quite innocuous what she was charged to have done. So I think, we really do have quite a lot of suspicions that these Australian citizens are really being used to, or were being used to punish Australia. And now that relations have improved, that we'll see improvement. We've got one more detained in China. And I think from my perspective, Australia has given up a lot to achieve these three objectives. I don't think China has actually given up anything so far, other than the illegal trade restrictions that it imposed in the first place. So that's bad behavior that it stopped. So from my perspective, it's returned to the status quo, but it hasn't actually been punished for that behavior. So what Australia has given up is that it's toned down or avoided confronting China on this coercive behavior. You won't hear Penny Wong mentioning trade coercion directly in the Australian context, as our previous government did quite a lot to rally international support for Australia. Australia's given up on it's directly given up on one WTO case against China on barley, on which 17 states plus the European Union joined as third parties, and which Australia was very likely to have won. And it has now suspended a case on wine. And really what to me this represents is giving up an opportunity to uphold the rules-based order that Australia goes on about and it likes to champion, and to isolate China for coercive behaviour. And you had a whole lot of other countries and the European Union willing to support Australia in that endeavour. So it's given the message that we're prioritising our domestic interests over our common interests in supporting the rules-based order, in my view. I think thirdly, Albanese has led a trade delegation to China. And you'll see lots of photographs of him and our Trade Minister, Don Farrell, at the trade delegation holding up lobsters which have been banned in China. And I think this sends a message that Australia is willing to forgive and forget, and not to exact a price for the 2-3 years of trade coercion. And it's also sending a signal to Australian business that it's okay to resume trade with China, that we should forget about these years of coercion. And I think, thirdly, that sends a contradictory message about de-risking efforts that Australia is part of with other countries in other democratic countries, and that it is, in fact, sending a light to Australian business that we're not really worried as much as we were about dependency on the Chinese market and reducing our vulnerability to future trade coercion, which may tie our hands at some future point.
Lavina, thanks for that really broad laydown there. You've already started getting into and anticipating my next question, which is really how much do we think this is kind of, a move, smiles, hugs, talking about, Tassie Devils and pandas, and how much of this is actually portent of things to come? And how much do we think that these moves are likely to shift the trajectory of some of Australia's future China policies? I'd be curious to hear your speculation on that. Starting on the trade front, if you see this as a move to make sure that those lobsters are sold, make sure that the wine has a market in China, or do you read this differently as a move away from the government nudging, propelling the private sector to diversify as quickly as possible? Curious for your take on that.
Well, I do think, Will, you mentioned earlier that our Prime Minister has been criticised for being away too much. I think for me, compared to the previous government, the China relationship isn't at the top of his priorities. I think, he's got a lot of domestic problems that he's going to have to solve when he comes home. And one of those is the fact that we are under a lot of cost of living pressures. The government's been blamed for a lot of that. So in a way, this kind of encouragement of trade is part of that solution. You can go back to the electorate and say, look, I've solved the China relationship. Now we've got a really good trade opening up, and the kind of rivers of gold will come back again, and we don't need to worry. So I'm not really that convinced that our Prime Minister is necessarily as worried about China as others might be. I think it's really important to think about whether Australia might be falling into Chinese traps in this way. That if you've got a Prime Minister basically going to China to encourage Australian business to become more dependent again, to forget the lessons about economic coercion, that actually allows a rebuilding of a constituency in Australia that the business community is always wanting better relations with China because their primary interest is to make profits. And that will make it harder for the Australian government to make hard decisions about de-risking the economy, But then also it might have implications for the types of hard decisions that we need to make, I think, about building deterrence and being part of coalitions that are attempting to deter China from taking further destabilizing actions in the South China Sea, but also in Taiwan. And all of that, I think, because we're prioritizing or have been prioritizing, in my view, over the last few months, this idea that we have to have this meeting, that it is actually meaning that Australia is becoming milder in its rhetoric about the differences that we have with China. So yes, I do think there will be a consequence for all of this. We have to watch it, obviously, within the next 6 months to see how it goes.
Thanks, Silvina. Ewan, look, you're somewhat recently, back to living in Australia, having come back down from Singapore. And I would, if you don't mind, I'd like to keep the conversation actually broadened at this point to begin to look at the effects of the trip, what it might portend, but also what it means for others. And in fact, when we were dialoguing before this even started, you rightly noted, this is an important trip that we should talk about and what it means, but it's not the only trip the Prime Minister has taken. You were saying this right before we started the live stream too. The Prime Minister has copped some flack at home for traveling a lot, but this has been a very busy month. He was in Washington, D.C. for a state visit. I think he was home for 3 days. Then he was up to China. Then he was down through the Cook Islands for the PIF leaders meeting. He had 2.5 days to catch his breath, and now he's in San Francisco for the APEC meeting, where, of course, President Biden is meeting with Xi Jinping, or actually just concluded his meeting. And let me just start there. When you kind of look at all these trips, if you begin to string them together for what statement this begins to make about the direction of Australian foreign policy, what does this all add up to? What's your take on what's happening now, not just vis-a-vis China, but kind of the movements with the United States, with the Pacific Islands and others, Ewan?
Sure, thanks, Charles. I think there is an elaborate choreography, as you've implied, and we should judge the China visit in a broader context, which starts with the Prime Minister's state visit to the US. That was the first and I think a very important visit. The joint statement was a strong one, so I think it sort of anchored gave cover, if you like, for the Prime Minister then to go back and repair the relationship with China in that context in which the alliance still was front and center of Australia's security and defence policies. And then after the visit to China, it wasn't just a visit to the Pacific Island Forum. There was a very interesting development for those who look at Australian foreign policy on the back of that, where Canberra concluded a landmark agreement with the very small island nation of Tuvalu, only 16,000 people in population, or even smaller than that. But the reason it's significant is this is something like American audiences will be familiar with the Compact of Free Association between the United States and Pacific Island countries. It wasn't exactly the same, but it's a grand bargain, what I'd call a grand bargain in microcosm, because of the small nature of Tuvalu. But it was an attempt both to address the climate change and human security concerns of the Pacific Islanders in Tuvalu, but also it includes a prominent security guarantee, which is the first of its kind that Australia has given at treaty level, binding it to commit Tuvalu against military aggression. That's the wording from the agreement. So I think that in that broad sweep, the China visit was to accomplish a particular task of economically stabilizing the relationship. But we can say, in the government's defense, that it didn't abandon the broader settings which we've seen in both of the alliance policy, but also the importance of the Pacific. And the Pacific is particularly key in the China-Australia dynamic. That's where they compete most obviously in a bilateral sense, because Australia, in relative terms, is a major power in the Pacific, and China has been moving in and with the Solomon Islands in particular. Concluding a recent agreement has worried many, not just in Canberra, but on your side of the pond in Washington too. I think the China visit, having said that, we can say that it was also very economically focused. I think, as Will and Lavina have said, that was the tenor of the visit. To unpack it slightly in terms of its order, the Prime Minister went first to Shanghai, attended this trade expo, and that was, I think, it set the tone. And in my view, while the economics have been front and center of the relationship, and in the context of China's economic punitive campaign against Australia, it rather sort of looked as if the low politics were dominant. And I think that is a position that China will be quite happy with, to have China in the context of an economic coercion campaign, send its top leader to China, and to be concerned with resetting the mechanics of the trade relationship. As you said, lobsters, wine, that sort of very granular, low politics. We could even say it's low economics, as it paints Australia in the position of being almost an agricultural supplier to the top tables of the Chinese leadership. And in that sense, I think it's quite shrewd on the part of China that's the narrative that Australia has effectively accepted. And I think, although it wasn't the only thing that the Prime Minister discussed, I think in terms of the optics, it did play to that narrative that this is the kind of relationship that China would like. I would agree with Will and Lavina in their characterization of Beijing's motivations. The one thing I would add to that is the reason China has calibrated is also because its campaign didn't work. It failed to coerce Australia into a more compliant mindset. And it also failed to cause macroeconomic damage to Australia. Several sectors were badly affected, and that obviously had an effect on those businesses that was considerable. But at the macroeconomic level, the real story was that Australia was able to diversify its markets and actually thrived. So I think that Beijing understood that maintaining that set of punishments was not delivering the message that it wanted. So eventually it had to do that, and the change of government provided the trigger to reset.
Thanks, Ewan. I want to stay on the kind of broader international context and pick up on something Lavina had said, that the response from the region. I'm curious. Look, you were in Singapore, you know Korea quite well, you know the entire region. I'm curious if you've heard anything yet from observers around the region about their reactions to the Prime Minister's visit and what they think it portends. Lavina, I'm not putting words in your mouth. One of the things that you noted was, in your analysis, a stepping away of kind of supporting the rules-based order by pulling down those WTO cases. We know that that over the past couple of years, Australia has played a leading position in standing up to and resisting Chinese attempted coercion in a number of different facets. I'm curious what you're hearing from around the region about if that's been noted, how that is being reacted to. Does the region read it similarly, differently? The region is obviously quite broad and diverse itself, but what are you hearing?
Well, I think it's still early, and we also have to read this in context of the still unfolding visit of Xi Jinping to Washington, to San Francisco, and meeting with President Biden. I think that is important context, because the US is also back in full scale engagement mode, so it doesn't put Australia out of sync with its ally in that sense. I think we can speculate that amongst the close Asian partners in Australia, there might be some dissonance. On the one hand, countries in Southeast Asia, which I think value their economic engagement with China and have felt that direct pressure from Beijing. If they look at Australia, on one hand, I think they may expect Australia to act and be vocal on such issues as the South China Sea. I think the Philippines is clearly the one in the front line there, and I think it is conspicuous that Australia hasn't been more vocal on recent incidents in the Philippines. It's made the big symbolic statements with the US in the joint statement context, but it actually hasn't reacted in the form of a significant statement from either the foreign minister or the defense minister when China has been clearly flouting the international law and provoking at the Second Thomas Shoal, which is this place where China's Coast Guard and other vessels have been harassing Philippine vessels engaged in legal activities within their waters. Others in Southeast Asia might be quite content to see Australia being able to have its cake and eat it too, as it were, to resume economic relations and to adopt a less confrontational mindset. I think that Southeast Asia's bar for taking China on is pretty low and getting lower, I think, incrementally. But it's a different story elsewhere. I wonder about Japan in particular. One thing we haven't mentioned, but the position of Australia towards China's candidature to join a major trade agreement, the CPTPP, came up during the visit. I think Australia has adopted a rather ambiguous position under the current government. It's not clear. It said it doesn't oppose China's candidature. And I think in some senses that might be stretching Japan's patience, because I think one interpretation of Australia's position is that it could be hiding behind the fellow member of Japan, which is more likely to, if push comes to shove, I think, oppose China's candidature of the CPTPP. But Australia is enjoying the luxury of sending out positive signals, but rather ambiguous ones that don't commit it one way or the other. I think you're absolutely right, just to take it back a bit and say that I think these countries are looking at Australia in the context of not just this visit, but over the last few years of Australia being subjected very obviously to a punishment campaign. And that may actually be the more important audience than China. We shouldn't forget that this visit, although it was very important for China, Xi Jinping, on the same day he met Prime Minister Albanese, met 3 other international leaders, including from Cuba and Serbia and elsewhere. So I think that there is a tendency sometimes to sort of over evaluate the importance of that visit. It was very important in an Australian political and economic context, particularly important to the Labour Party because they have this 50th anniversary that you've referenced. But I think the important part about the messaging is that Australia's Prime Minister and government do need to remember that they're not being looked at just in terms of narrow economic policy and the coercion campaign, but it's really the example of how Australia has withstood this period of frostiness from Beijing and its ability to recalibrate, but also to stand up for all of the high politics, because the high politics is the high ground in this case. And once you've been cast in the role of being a salesman, it's quite difficult to then step up to be a statesman.
Thanks, Ewan. Let me start broadening the conversation a little bit. As we've done both kind of the tactical, we've kind of stepped back and done the strategic. Will, you can kick us off here, or you can punt and not kick us off here. But one of the questions that I have is, okay, we've seen the resumption of ties. We've seen a handshake. We've seen the lobsters. the next 6 months, if nothing else, are probably going to look fairly sunny in China-Australian relations. I think we can expect that for beef, for wine, and for lobsters, those will probably come off. So at least on the superficial and clearly on the trade front, things will probably look up for the next 6 months, contingencies notwithstanding. But I'd be curious to get from you, and I said you will go first, but from all of you, which areas you think are likely to progress now a little bit further and a little faster, and which areas actually are going to get harder for China and Australia to converge on. I have my own list, but I'd be curious what you guys make of this. Will, do you mind kicking us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. Look, I actually think I kind of disagree with all of that. I think to start with on the trade thing, there's been a lot about talk about the coercion campaign. The truth is, it, like Ewan said, it just didn't nudge the Australian economy, right? So I think the government went out of its way to lower expectations about what would come from this, and we should lower our expectations. The Australian trade relationship with China remained good despite the breakdown in the political relationship. Actually, the highest ever level of exports to China was under the Morrison government in 2021. It's because iron ore prices were up. And this year, it looks like the export from the current numbers, the Prime Minister went to China with it running it just above that. So it's on track for a new record. But that's actually almost all about the addition of lithium as an export to China. So it's big structural reasons that Australia, Ewan said earlier, we look like an agricultural supplier. We might look like that because we talk so much about lobsters, which haven't actually been allowed in anyway. But when we're actually an exporter of strategic resources, iron ore, LNG, coal, and now lithium that China needs. And I think something that's been lost in this conversation, it seems to me, is the Australian system is now dealing with China much more confidently. We've always known we had a huge proportion of our exports to China, right? And so there's been this understandable anxiety about what China could do to us to change our foreign policy, change how we operate in the world because of our economic vulnerability or what we thought it was. We've just had this massive stress test over the last 4 years, and it turns out the Australian economy isn't vulnerable like people thought we were. A couple of industries are. Lobsters and wine are the top two. And surprise, surprise, they haven't been allowed in yet, right? All the products China needed have been allowed back in. The two that it can get by without, which, by the way, account for less than 1% of Australia's exports to China, lobsters and wine combined, they're not in yet. And you said they will likely be allowed in. We'll see. I mean, people in the lobster industry before the trip told me they thought they would be allowed back in within a matter of days. After the trip, the same people are on the phone to me saying, Will, did you hear anything? We haven't heard anything. Our Chinese suppliers have no detail. And the Australian government told me after the trip, they speak broadly that they've got assurances from the Chinese that, a good relationship politically will lead to a restoration in the trade ties, but they don't have any specifics on that. So we'll wait and see. And that, I mean, the sentiment amongst the Australian business community as well, it is not all in on China. That's just not true. This trip was very much about defending established trade patterns, right? So the iron ore industry, LNG, increasingly lithium, they want to just defend exports that are already there. But diversification is very real in that they continue their trade to China, but they all have a China plus strategy, if not a more explicit diversification strategy. I mean, they've seen what happened. If you're in a vulnerable industry, you're investing in other markets. It doesn't mean you ignore China, but the risk that's there, a lot of businesses won't say it publicly. The comments they'll give me on the record, if they will, are often very kind or gentle about China, but privately, they've seen what's happened to this, and it's really changed their business decisions. And the other thing that's happened in recent history is the Inflation Reduction Act has completely upended investment decisions in Australia. America, and being in an American non-Chinese supply chain for a whole bunch of businesses in Australia is the most attractive thing. And so it's not the case that the Australian business community has this sort of hive mind focus on China. It's just not like that. There's a real split within it. There are China exposed and China dependent ones. Some are vulnerable, but thankfully that's a small group. Many are hugely profitable and Australia's biggest taxpayers. They're feeling pretty confident and happy that relationships have been restored, even though they weren't hurt. But there's this other big group of Australian businesses that are frankly looking everywhere but China for their future.
Yeah, that's interesting, Will. As we talk about things that might get easier, maybe it's not lobsters, but there are clearly a couple of things coming down the pike that are going to become harder. I'll give you my short list for Lavina and Ewan to correct, edit, or tell me where I'm wrong. When I look down the pike of what's coming towards Australia, it looks to me like the pressure on trade via the CPTPP, as Ewan alluded to, is going to increase from Beijing. The pressure on China to play a role in the critical mineral sector is clearly going to increase. And the pressure on investment into China, particularly around advanced and emerging technology, is going to increase because all of these are parts of the strategic competition that we see playing out. It strikes me as those are three pressure points that are likely to go up, not down, as we look forward. But Lavina and you and I'd be curious for your take about what we anticipate getting easier and what's going to become demonstrably harder. Lavina, go ahead. Lavina, you're still on mute.
I think I would agree that Australia's economy definitely did show how resilient it was to Chinese coercion. You will note that a lot of the things that were contained in that coercive campaign were not the things that China really needed. So it didn't ban iron ore, obviously. So it's one of those things where, yes, Albanese met Xi in China, led a trade delegation, but I don't think our strategic minerals were really at risk. And they weren't at risk before and they aren't at risk now. As long as China needs them, that will continue on. I think in terms of expectations about what comes next, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm always very pessimistic about everything, but I think that I had very low expectations going into this meeting. And I think that they were met in the sense that if you look at the joint statement that was released at the end, it was all about, yes, let's resume our dialogue with one another and let's talk about trade. And that's fine. That's probably as good as it gets. There wasn't any big announcements about any new cooperation or collaboration. But I think that from the Chinese perspective, they want things to go beyond stabilization, what Australia talks about as stabilization. They want us to go back to the idea that we're open to cooperation and collaboration with China in various areas. It's not just about having kind of stable, non-wolf warrior type relations with one another. And I personally think that it's actually going to be extremely difficult. I don't see there being many areas at all where things are going to get a lot better, other than on these kind of, as Ewan might describe them as kind of lowbrow trade openings, in the sense that there's real differences between Australia and China, and they haven't gone away. Chinese behaviour in our region has not changed at all. Ewan mentioned the coercive tactics against the Philippines. Harassment of claimant states in the South China Sea goes on. Daily incursions into Taiwanese airspace, sea, goes on every day. It becomes almost normalized. We don't even talk about it anymore. It's just part of the landscape. But all of those things continue. Our ASIO boss recently spoke of an increase in cyber attacks in Australia by Chinese actors. We've still got foreign interference going on. So then we've got AUKUS and the DSR, we've got the Quad, we've got all of those things that China doesn't like. And China, I'm sure in this meeting, would have expressed some displeasure about AUKUS and the Quad. So I really think that there's so many things that are not going to be able to be resolved by just diplomatic dialogue. There's going to be continuous differences that will have to be expressed. And I can see that China is not actually stepping back. In fact, I think it's just continuing on and advancing its claims, its deterrence of Taiwanese independence. So for me, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to see how there could be actual cooperation and collaboration between China and Australia. Other than these kind of trade relationship, I don't see the avenues.
Ewan, let me take this into the policy prescriptive realm for a second. One of the questions we got from Jim Caruso, who used to be the U.S. Acting Ambassador in Australia. He now works with us here at the Australia chair. It's a pretty straightforward question. He asks, what's your thoughts, you collectively, but about how to keep China abiding by their international obligations? Pretty simple, but a very challenging question. And specifically on trade, he asked about how to respond for China's penchant for breaking the rules and then restoring conditions at a time of China's choosing with no consequences. What is the policy prescription for how to deal with that? Or is it something that when they resume, we ignore and carry on as it was before? What's your take on this enormously large question?
You've already referenced the decision to drop the 2 WTO cases. I think that's how not to do it. If you are serious about defending the multilateral institutions and a rules-based order as a medium-sized country, then I think the worst precedent you can do is to pursue and then drop in favor of a pragmatic bilateral accommodation, as Australia has done on barley and now wine. So I think that that's a sign of that things are sort of edging in the direction I think again that Beijing would like. It wants to settle its differences bilaterally, thereby splitting off the allies and the partners and dealing with them one by one in the classic divide and conquer rule. I think there's also a more subtle challenge. Not just a specific policy friction point, but it's really a kind of, it's how you frame the way in which you deal with China. And it gives me slight concern that although that Australia has not changed its fundamental policy settings, I think it is at danger of being drawn back into a relationship framed paradigm, which again plays to China's interests rather than a national interest framing. Now, the Prime Minister was very clear to say that he was pursuing national interest framing, perhaps more towards the economic side than elsewhere. But I think also implicit in some of the comments that he made in press conferences while in China, it was clear that he did place a lot of stock on relationship building with Xi Jinping in face-to-face terms. He characterized that as an honest and straightforward conversation. Now, maybe we can aim off for some of that in that he wants obviously to project as positive an outcome from that visit as possible. But I think it is also a risk that the government is in danger of falling for some of its own rhetoric that it believes it has handled China more subtly and better, more diplomatically, more in a more disciplined fashion, and is rather overplaying that as a factor in the change of behavior from Beijing, whereas actually Beijing is changing its behavior because its policy of coercion didn't work. So I think that may be an analytical challenge that the government needs to keep its in front of mind, that this is it can be an illusion, a trap in which Beijing has said that Australia then believes that it has handled China better, and the consequence of that is path dependency. That then Australia decides not to make another statement that's in danger of prejudicing the next high-level visit, and then you're into the sort of the danger of being self-censoring and silence on events. back to the triggers, I think one thing I'll say very briefly, going back to the South Pacific, let's not forget this is where Australia and China edge up against each other most in a one-on-one sense, most directly. And the rule book for how they interact is much less clear than it is, say, in the Taiwan Strait. I do worry a bit about that. We've got the Solomon Islands, where we've got contending policing operations, both on the Chinese side, which does have now People's Armed Police sent to the Solomon Islands to support the Pacific Games, which are being held there from this weekend. Australia and New Zealand have sent their own. And I think that is something that, that there is a potential for that to get worse. The fact that Australia has entered into that agreement with Tuvalu shows that they know that there is no truce, that there is still a contending geopolitical competition. It won't be called that, but that's what it is. And I think that is the area where I'm slightly more concerned that Australia and China are going to end up in an unscripted confrontation of some kind, not necessarily a military one, but I think the potential is there.
Can I take this for a second out of our high-minded strategic discussion and get really crass and talk about politics? Because one of the questions that we have been discussing and batting around to is, where do we think this is likely to evolve to? What's going to happen next? We talked about what China may or may not do. We talked about what Australian businesses are or are not doing, but we haven't yet begun to kind of pulse how this trip has played inside of Australia. It's probably too early. I mean, there's a little bit of polling around this, but curious if you can help frame the conversation clearly for Americans who don't watch Australian politics quite as closely as all of you do, but about both how much support did the PM have for this visit? Are there signs of fracture around this? Is it broadly supportive? What do we see public opinion doing on this? Will, why don't you start us off on that, because you're someone who writes daily on this very phenomenon.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we don't have snap polling that shows the Australian public's immediate response to the trip, but we do have a long body of work from various think tanks showing the profound souring of Australian public opinion towards China, which, as you said, I mean, you only go back 6 years ago and Australia's a real outlier there, much more positive views towards China because of that economic relationship, which continues, right? But what we do have for, I think, what I use as a useful guide to what's going to happen next. We'll see if it's borne out, but go back and look at what happened in Japan when its relationship with China blew up in 2010, right? There's a massive reset in Japanese public opinion. It never came back, right? It's the negative attitudes towards China went from something like 50% to about 90%. They've come down about 2%. You look at South Korea, a very similar thing that happened in their 2016 breakdown. Total inversion of their public sentiment towards China, reset into that Japanese class. And exactly the same thing happened with Australia by 2018, 2019. I expect, like Japan, like South Korea, the Australian public will remain negative about China for at least a generation. I mean, until something changes in Beijing. It's not forgotten in Australia. And so that's the public sentiment environment the Australian government's going to have to navigate, whether it's the Labor Party, the coalition, right? And that's what puts such a low ceiling, on this relationship. I think, one of the markers for me was at the end of the trip, the final press conference in the Great Hall of the People. Prime Minister Albanese was asked how would he like this trip or think this trip will be remembered in history, and he said it's an important step in the journey towards stabilization, right? Stabilization is an ongoing journey that, as far as I can see, will continue so long as Xi Jinping is the leader of China, right? It's a never-ending thing. We're not actually, they don't actually say we've reached stability, because, as you say, you don't look very far forward. You see a Taiwan election, a messy US political cycle, pressure on CPTP application, a whole lot of challenges to any sort of stability in that relationship. So it's going to be just tough working to keep it as, towards stabilized.
Now, Lavina, I'd ask you to speculate on domestic politics if you want, but let me just note that you talked about dissonance earlier, or potential issues of dissonance. Jude Blanchette, who's one of our China scholars here at CSIS, noted the elaborate choreography and the sequencing of those moves. First the United States, then China, then back to the U.S. and San Francisco. This is a purely speculative question, Lavina, but do you think that she heard consistent messages from the two Democratic allies, or is this something that Chinese leadership is likely to see as an opportunity to attempt to wedge further apart? Noting that the only one of the four of us who was in the room was Will, and noting that he wasn't in the room for the important parts of the conversation either.
Look, I don't. I think, that as I mentioned already, that I thought some aspects of the messaging that Albanese took to China was contradictory. So, he goes to the United States and his primary objective is to reassure the United States that Australia is all on board with AUKUS, that we're firm in the alliance and that we're not going to do anything to undermine the alliance when he goes to China. Now, when I say contradictory, I mean, the dropping of the WTO cases and the kind of promotion of Australian trade, I think sends that kind of mixed signal of here we've got Australia as part of a coalition of democratic countries led by the United States, trying to reroute and de-risk supply chains. Yet taking advantage of a possible bilateral opening on trade to make some profits for themselves. So it could be interpreted as, well, how much on board are you? And I take in point that, businesses do make their own decisions. So as Will mentioned, there are too many opportunities. There's many opportunities that are arising with the Biden administration's economic policies that they will want to take advantage of. They will want to be a part of this rerouting of supply chains. But I think what I'm worried about is that idea of, the Australian population. I think Will is correct to say that they're very sceptical about China. I think in the lead up to this meeting, I think the public sentiment was about skepticism. And I love to read comment pages and of different articles that people write, and the overwhelming response is usually skepticism. Yes, don't fall for it. Albo, make sure that you've got your head screwed on when you meet him, and not to kind of give too many things away. So I think these kinds of public sentiment is not going to change. There's a deep level of skepticism. I think if I were our allies looking at Australia, I would be a little bit worried about this idea of self-censorship that Ewan was talking about. One of the things that I think there's a kind of misread lesson of the reasons why the relationship deteriorated. I think it's not so much about tone. It's not that the previous government used the wrong language to oppose Chinese policies. It was that Australia took leading positions. We were an activist middle power. We were leading on banning Huawei in our 5G networks. We led on foreign interference. We led on the South China Sea. We released strong statements at the time in 2016 about the illegality of Chinese activities and that they needed to abide by international law. So that's what really angered the Chinese, was the fact that we took those leading positions and then we also encouraged other countries to do it as well. And other countries started listening to us and talking to us to get our best practices and to learn from what we did and to copy them. So I do think that there's a toning down of that approach in order to, we keep talking about this word stabilization, but I'm really very unclear still as to what stabilization actually involves. It appears to involve not really being as strong in confronting China about its bad behavior. It seems to mean toning down that criticism and maybe saying things behind closed doors. But that's actually what China would want. It doesn't want Australia to be an activist middle power. The other thing that I would mention, I think we go back to this CPTPP, Albanese's language on being open to Chinese membership. I think that's completely the wrong signal to have sent. Perhaps he's not briefed properly. Maybe he didn't intend it. But the damage gets done because it really leaves Japan out on its own, defending an agreement that is really upholding standards that China can never meet. And when I think about, okay, does this mean that if they say they're open to China, what about Taiwan? Where does that leave Taiwan? What signals are we willing to send about Taiwan's membership of the CPTPP? Because obviously Taiwan does meet the criteria. And so why is it that we're holding ourselves back? Now, in terms of activist middle power, okay, I'm speculating, but I think if we had a Liberal government, the same Morrison government was still in power right now, they would be supporting Taiwan's membership of the CPTPP as part of a deterrence mechanism to China to allow Taiwan to accede to institutions that don't require statehood as a membership criteria, as a means to say, you know, we support Taiwan and the status quo, and allowing Taiwan to have better opportunities to trade, but also not to be diplomatically isolated.
Look, I'm watching the time. You guys have been very nice. Will, you can go back to sleep soon, but Lavina's just spectacularly failed for all of us because she gave us a very thoughtful, nuanced response about how things could or could not go different ways and what stabilization did or did not portend. I want to go in the exact opposite direction and be the opposite of thoughtful here. And because stabilization is really the high note of everything that was talked about, we know that the government in Canberra said, this is not a reset. This is the goal of stabilization. Here you go. This is your final lightning round question. And you don't have a minute. You don't have 2 minutes. You have one sentence. I don't know. I'm picking from the screen here, but you and I think you're my first victim. Stabilization means fill in the blank, please.
It's the wrong framing. I don't think you can have hope for a stabilized relationship with an unstable entity like the CCP leadership. I think that's going to come back on Australia. So I think the problem is actually it's the incorrect framing.
You did not complete my sentence. Point noted. Will, let's see if you can do better. Stabilization means and will lead to fill in the blank.
Yeah, it means low expectations, but we keep talking.
All right. Well, now we have the fully articulated version, the wrong question, Edel, and the very brief response. So look, it is the end of the hour. Really appreciative of the three of you taking the time to explain to us what happened, what it means, some of the pitfalls and challenges that Canberra might face, and how the rest of the region is responding to this. A really excellent conversation. I thank you all. I thank especially Mr. Glasgow, who can now go back to bed. But as I've told all my Australian mates, coffee's on me next time around. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks for having me.